Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Wednesday, the 28th of January, 2026. This is Robert. Jared and I will be standing in for Mike today, and let's get started with Inside the Beltway. Over in the Senate Majority Leader John Thune said that both Republicans and Democrats are in talks with the White House to avoid a partial government shutdown on Friday. Thune said that Senate Republicans have asked Democrats for a concrete list of demands on immigration enforcement to get the Homeland Security funding bill passed. Thune said during an interview yesterday as well that this is an inflection point for immigration enforcement. I think this is a signal that he may be soft on allowing some restrictions to the Democrats to add some restrictions to the DHS funding bill. And Senate Democrats are also circulating a polling memo that's telling them they should play hardball on the DHS bill and ICE restrictions. So I think they're unlikely to back down without something from the Senate Republicans. I think now a partial government shutdown is likely because either Senate Democrats force a partial government shutdown over this DHS bill, which is still scheduled for a vote on Thursday, or Republicans give into some Democrat demands and rewrite the bill. But the House is in recess until after the deadline. So I think we're likely now to see at least a partial government shutdown, even if it is short. Over in the House, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said that House Democrats are going to force an impeachment vote targeting Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem unless President Donald Trump fires Noem immediately. And they could force a vote using a privileged resolution, which would require House leadership to schedule a vote within 2 days of that resolution being presented. I don't think it's likely that Trump fires Noem, and I do think if they force that vote, it's unlikely to leave the House, and very unlikely to end in a conviction in the Senate. Moving to the domestic side, Indivisible founder Ezra Levine said that they are planning a third nationwide No Kings protest on the 28th of March. They said they're aiming for 9 million attendees for this No Kings event in March, though I think that's unlikely. They claimed 5 million, I think they claimed 7 million at the last No Kings event in October, which I think is an overestimation. Levine said that they are holding de-escalation and nonviolent documentation training sessions ahead of this event as well. In Virginia, yesterday, Virginia Democrats said they were going to consider a bill to set a special election for redistricting on the 21st of April, but late yesterday, a Tazewell County, Virginia court ruled that Virginia Democrats' attempt to pass the state constitutional amendment allowing mid-decade redistricting was illegal and did not follow both Virginia law or proper procedure. So for now, this puts a stop to Virginia redistricting, and I think this is likely to remain in force until it makes its way to the state Supreme Court. The ruling says, interestingly, that they have to wait until 2027 at the earliest to actually put forward this amendment. But even if this doesn't stand at the state Supreme Court, I think practically this is likely not going to be in time for the 2026 midterm. Over in Minneapolis, anti-ICE activists held a protest at Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's office yesterday at the Minnesota Capitol building in St. Paul. The activists, they were chanting ICE out and do your job at Tim Walz. I think this is a reaction to the news that, as Boarder Czar Tom Homan has now talked to Governor Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, the perception on the ground is that Minnesota and Minneapolis officials are now cooperating with the Trump administration on immigration enforcement. Also in Minneapolis yesterday, a man charged at Representative Ilhan Omar during a town hall event and sprayed Omar with an unlit liquid. He was arrested and charged with third-degree assault. I do think this was a legitimate attack targeting Ilhan Omar, and this is similar to the milkshaking thing that was going around in 2020. Effectively, far left militants and activists were targeting conservative politicians, right wing and perceived right wing individuals, public figures with milkshakes. Basically, they would take these milkshakes, fill them with concrete, and during public events, hit them with them. Which the idea here was there was an implicit message of basically, I can get it close enough to kill you or assassinate you. And I think in this case, there was a similar thing here, that the implicit message here was that I can get close enough to you in a public event to do harm to you. And this is an indicator, I think, of increasing political tension, and that we're seeing now this type of thing targeting Democratic politicians as well, not just Republican politicians or conservative figures, is an indicator of just an increasing an increasing base level of political tension. Over in New York and California, Democrats are pushing or they're advancing their own bills allowing residents to sue federal agents for alleged violations of civil rights. The California Senate passed their own bill, which will now head to the state assembly. And New York State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins said that the similar bill in New York is on a fast track to pass. Like the Illinois Bivens Act, the intent here is to undermine the Trump administration's incapacity. The idea is to tie up federal agents and officials in civil lawsuits, and I think also motivate individual agents to refuse to deploy for immigration enforcement in these states. And then over in Philadelphia, during a press conference yesterday to announce what they're calling an ice out package of local bills, Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner said that prosecutors around the U.S. are rallying around Minneapolis County Attorney Mary Moriarty. He said that these prosecutors will ensure any federal agents who, quote, commit crimes will be held accountable. He said, quote, if we hunt you down the way they hunted Nazis down for decades, we'll find your identities. I think, one, this is more of this rhetoric on charging ICE agents after Trump leaves office. I think the assumption among state and local Democrats is that a Democrat will win the White House in 2028 and provide a friendlier administration that will allow the state and local level Democratic officials to prosecute ICE agents for immigration enforcement. But I think this is also an indicator that there's more of this blue state coalition coordination going on. So for redistricting, for the sanctuary city policies and the resistance to the Trump administration, there's already been a lot of apparent coordination. And I think in this case, this is another indicator of another area of coordination for Democrat controlled states. And obviously larger Democrat controlled cities, sanctuary cities, are doubling down on their sanctuary policies and anti-ICE local laws. I think the Trump administration's objective with Minneapolis was to pressure officials to cooperate with immigration enforcement. And I think the Trump administration could use that as an example for some of these smaller sanctuary cities, but larger sanctuary cities like Philadelphia are likely to have a higher resistance capacity, because I think it's important to remember that there are more sanctuary cities in the United States than just Minneapolis and Philadelphia and Seattle and Portland. There are hundreds of sanctuary cities of all kinds of different sizes around the United States, including in Republican states. And I think we're going to see a lot more resistance from the larger cities, and potentially after Minneapolis with the Trump administration, I think they'll be able to leverage more pressure on these smaller sanctuary cities. And then finally, 5051, Flare, an organization called Flare USA, and the Citizens Impeachment Movement announced National Lobbying Day of Action on the 17th of February. These groups plan to host organized meetings at the home district offices of all 435 members of Congress, and they're going to lobby representatives to impeach President Donald Trump. I think, at least prior to the midterms, that's unlikely to actually happen. Though if Democrats do take the House, I expect that President Trump is going to face another impeachment attempt that will likely fail in the Senate, like the last 3 attempts did during the first Trump administration. All right, Jared, if you could come on and take us through the global sit rep, please.
Absolutely. We are going to start off in the Middle East. President Trump just this morning called for Iran to come to the table and negotiate a nuclear deal, or risk an attack far worse than Operation Midnight Hammer. And Trump did confirm this will involve the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which we just covered yesterday, had entered the Middle East over the weekend. Going over to the other side of Asia, the Japanese prime minister said earlier this week that Japan must be involved in a Taiwan contingency to rescue Japanese and American citizens in Taiwan. She also said that if Japan did nothing and simply fled while the U.S. military was being attacked, the Japan-U.S. alliance would collapse. So this is her doubling down, tripling down on her statements to get involved in a Taiwan contingency. And staying over in the Pacific, the Australian government is looking to force China to divest from a key port in northern Australia. There was some talk about this last year, and they're actually trying to develop a timeline now. The Chinese ambassador to Australia said Beijing would be forced to intervene if Australia did follow through on this threat. And China's foreign ministry gave a kind of weird response to this. They said that this should be a stern warning for Australia to respect China's position on the Taiwan question. The port divestment is actually about Australian sovereignty. Moving much closer to home, Mexican President Sheinbaum said yesterday that Mexico is going to temporarily stop shipping oil to Cuba due to fluctuations in oil supply. She did stress that this is a decision by Mexico, and because she had been accused of bending to pressure from President Trump over this. And the Trump administration and State Department have made no bones about wanting to see Mexico stop oil shipments to Cuba. Down in Venezuela, there's been a lot of talk recently about the Venezuelan president saying that they've had enough of American influence, but she just said yesterday that she's working with President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio through channels of communication, respect, and courtesy to establish a work agenda, so an actual plan of action to resolve the differences between the U.S. and Venezuela. And lastly, on our northern border, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney told Canadian media yesterday that he's not backing down from his speech in Davos, despite what Treasury Secretary Bessent told the media. Now, Carney claims that he told President Trump over the phone, I meant what I said in Davos, which is trying to establish a middle pole of power to counterbalance China and the United States.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to the Homeland Operations SITREP. Yesterday, Ken Klippenstein said that he had a memo leaked to him from a DHS source that said that Operation Metro Surge is in a, quote, steady state and will continue as planned. This leaked memo was written by the acting assistant chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. I think this is interesting because Klippenstein clearly has some political bias, especially against the Trump administration, but his DHS source does appear to be credible, and previous leaked documents appear to be legitimate. He leaked the documents about the different operations, including Operation at Large. And I think the veracity of this memo is supported by Trump official statements on Operation Metro Surge, and that it will continue, and reports on the ground of continuing immigration raids and cooperation from local police. Border Czar Tom Homan also said in an interview last week that he was pushing to set up a database of these anti-ICE activists that are arrested for interfering or impeding ICE operations. I think this database is likely already underway. There was that video, that viral video. Well, I'm not sure how viral it went, but the video from Maine last week with that federal agent who was recording the anti-ICE activists, who were recording him and saying that they were going to be placed on a database. I think it is already underway because there has been a step up built by ICE and DHS in building their intelligence collection and analysis capabilities specifically for ICE operations. This includes that Palantir Elite app we reported on a couple of weeks ago. The idea there is that effectively ICE would have a database and an app they could use to determine what areas of a city or state that they're operating in has what kind of density of potential targets for removal are in the city or state they're operating in. And I think DHS could use a database of anti-ICE activists who are arrested for assaulting or impeding ICE agents into this database to determine things like what areas of a city or state have the highest levels of anti-ICE activity, and potentially when these activists are arrested, determine what level of outside activists are moving into different cities and states where ICE is operating at, because that is one of the things that was happening in Minneapolis, or likely happening in Minneapolis, is that there were a lot of people coming from outside of Minneapolis and outside of Minnesota to conduct anti-ICE activities. That activist who was and shot in that officer-involved shooting at the beginning of January. In the first week, they had, from what I understand, her and her wife had actually come from outside of Minneapolis to conduct these activities. And there have been other activists spotted in Minneapolis from outside of the state. There was a Party for Socialism and Liberation activist from Boston allegedly spotted in Minneapolis last week conducting some direct action demonstrations. So I think that's one area where ICE is likely to use this database if they do follow through with what Homeland said he's planning or pushing for DHS to do, is in conjunction with determining where the highest level of potential targets of illegal aliens with final orders of removal. I think they could use this type of database to also determine where the highest levels of anti-ICE activity are, how prevalent out-of-state activists are in different areas. All right, moving on to our questions and answer session. Jerry, if you could pull up some questions for us, please. From Bad Rabbit, do you know what the liquid was? No, I have not seen yet if they said what the liquid was. I think obviously it wasn't something like acid, because she continued the town hall after the incident. I did watch the video. It is a little unusual, I think, the response to it, because I've seen speculation from some, including in the chat, that it was staged. I'm not sure that it was staged necessarily. I mean, it's not just potentially conservative counter-organizing or right-wing counter-organizing or conservatives that disagree with Omar. There's actually some left-wing, from what I've seen, some more left-wing activist type people who are not big fans of the squad type people, that see the DSA had, there was a big push for them, obviously, to back some of these Democratic candidates, in the 2018, 2020 elections. And some of them, like, that were elected back to the DSA, they started viewing these people as basically they were getting these people elected and they were aligning more with the establishment Democratic Party rather than the DSA. And that actually pushed a big shift in the DSA to shift from focusing on Democratic candidates, backing them, to like building their own cadres and their own candidates. So it's not necessarily, it's without knowing yet what the motivation was. It could be someone who is upset at her for what they view as betraying the left wing, or it could be a right wing counter organizer. Right now, the only thing that's known is what's in the video, and then that the guy was charged with third-degree assault. All right, next question, please. From Sarkar Darkstar, what will happen with the non-state actors that currently control the autonomous zone set up by the state now that the feds are working with walls, supposedly? Well, if it's anything like the Portland encampment outside of the ICE facility, well, the local police are probably going to roll in and clear that up. They've already done it a couple times to some of these other no-go zones, like the one near the Renee Good officer-involved shooting. They put up some barriers in that neighborhood, and they were taken down by city employees. And I think they already did do that once to this other one near the shooting of Alex Preddy. That they did come in and start taking down some of the barriers. I imagine that's going to be, as more of this deal is worked out between Walz and Fry and the Trump administration to start supporting ICE operations, I imagine the local cops are going to roll in and start clearing out that area. Next question, please. Anonymous Anglo, did Trump cave in Minneapolis? Are deportation operations being scaled back, only deporting violent illegals? I saw that Nick Sorter said that a guy on the ground told him, a CBP guy on the ground told him that. I'm not sure how credible he is right now, because he's the one that originally came out with the story that Bovino was being demoted. So far, all the official word from the White House and DHS is that that's not true. This leaked memo from Klippenstein says that they're going to continue Operation Metro Surge as planned. And the 3,000 federal agents ramp up was supposed to be temporary anyway. I don't think they're going to be scaling back beyond what Operation Metro Surge was originally. I imagine the temporary surge is going to be scaled back as they start deploying to other cities. On the deporting violent illegals only thing, frankly, I think that's mostly messaging from the Trump administration because statistically, and Democrats have been hitting him with this statistically, like 75% of illegal immigrants that they have deported so far since the beginning of the Trump administration have not been, quote, violent illegals. And I think a big part of this is also there's a push from Democrats in the Congress to require the ICE to have judicial warrants. Well, there's a problem with that. Even if you do only want to go after the violent criminal illegals, that requires basically someone who's here illegally that might have even committed a crime where they come from or committed crimes here and gotten convicted. Because there's a thing going around in some of these sanctuary cities and states where they are undercharging illegal aliens who commit crimes so they don't trigger ICE detainers. Well, now you have a problem because the person has been maybe convicted of a misdemeanor, served their time, and been let out. And now ICE needs a judicial warrant to go get them. I think a big part of this whole thing is a messaging thing from the Trump administration because that is more amenable to most people, I think, on a messaging side, despite what polling says, where multiple polls have showed that a majority of Americans want deportations of all illegal immigrants, and some are even pretty much on the edge of wanting deportations of legal immigrants. Next question, please. From Ben T. If a state like Minnesota is taken over by fraudulent leadership via an electoral coup, at least at a state level, doesn't this preclude the need for an insurgency? Well, I think that politics is a complex system. Actually, Jared and I were just talking about this before the show. Politics is a complex system. You have multiple people with multiple motivations and conceptions of what they're doing. I think Democrats, on average, the Democratic Party views immigration as a political project. In Minnesota, the DFL, the Democrat Farmer Labor Party, a lot of them are activists or involved in activism. But I think people like Tim Walz and Jacob Fry, they view the anti-ICE activists as a tool to stave off the pressure from the Trump administration. But in this case, if they are turning on them, or I shouldn't say turning on them, they are cooperating with the Trump administration, those anti-ICE activists view them as betraying them. That's what a lot of I've seen over the last 24 hours of activists saying, and left-wing commentators and Democratic commentators, political commentators saying on the ground that activists are viewing this as they're being betrayed by Minnesota officials. I think there's the potential that they have, like the larger Democratic Party, attempting to use far left populist sentiment to their political advantage. I think maybe they were trying to do that in Minnesota as well, and maybe have lost, or if they've had any real control over that, lost control over that. So I think we might see this start turning against Walz and Fry as well. So I don't think, and again, like Mike has said before, this isn't an insurgency. This is an organized resistance. And an organized resistance doesn't necessarily have to focus on just the Trump administration. Well, now that local police are cooperating with the Trump administration, now they'll probably be turning some of their focus on the local police and the state police and Governor Tim Walz, as we saw yesterday with this protest. Next question, please. From He Hate Me, why do you think our government seems so incompetent when dealing with the fraud and organized resistance against the federal government? Well, a big part of it is capacity. There's only, let's just take ICE as an example. Prior to this hiring surge, there was fewer than 10,000 ICE agents. There's only so many. Just zooming out to the entire United States, roughly on average, there's about 1.5 cops per 100 or per 1,000 residents in the United States. There's just a huge capacity issue. The federal government can't be everywhere at all times, physically at least, to enforce the law. So there is a lot of room for criminal activity to happen. you also have to have know that there's a potential for fraud going on to focus on it. And there's so many different areas to focus on. I just think it's a matter of capacity, not necessarily incompetence. And at the state level, when you're talking about potentially political officials being involved in fraudulent programs that are taking money from the federal government, there might be a motivation not to investigate, frankly. Next question, please, Jared. Shackman, can you give an example of the type of event that would spur the political cultural right to organize in a similar fashion to the left? Well, Mike talked about this the other day, is that if we see a triggered event in Minneapolis, for example, after the last two officer involved shootings, there's a ramp up in pressure among anti-ICE activists and far left for some type of response. And there was that the comment from some of those far left groups, Minneapolis could be our Fallujah. Well, if there was an incident where some far left group conducted an ambush against ICE agents or CBP agents in Minneapolis, that would be a trigger event. And I have, as I said before, I think there is a growing perception on the right in the United States that either the Trump administration is failing or is failing to act. And so I think that pressure building up in some type of trigger event, like a direct ambush on ICE agents in Minneapolis, that could be a trigger event for counter organizing. Frankly, I think the revelations about how organized the anti-ICE activist movement should be a catalyst for counter organizing, because Cam Higbee leaked those group chats and all of the dispatches and things going on with the anti-ICE movement. I think that should be a catalyst for counter organizing. People should be going out and building relationships with local politicians and political parties, but building their own networks, creating communications networks like we saw there, organizing with other groups, other politically motivated groups that want to get out, not work for political campaigns, lobby, stuff like that. I think that should already be happening. If it is, the question of if it is or not seems to be up in the air for some people, for most of the United States, but I think it should already be happening. There should be, as Mike has said, you should be building your network. You should be doing your area studies, getting involved with local political parties and movements, organizing, help volunteering for political campaigns for people that you want to see elected to office. Next question, please. From Ben T, I think Trump got Walz to do what he wanted in the first place. With regard to deporting violent detainees, what did Trump give up in this negotiation? Well, I'm not sure what he gave up, but I think the speculation that maybe he said, well, Bovino will go somewhere else and take some portion of CBP with him, or the CBP agents that were deployed to Metro Search to support ICE operations with him, might have been what he quote unquote gave up. But the thing is, with CBP, they're not supposed to be going around and using the administrative warrants to get illegal aliens with final removal orders. That's ICE's mission. CBP was there to support them, and in Midway, Blitz, Charlotte's Web, Cataloosa Crunch, they were there to support ICE. And if the local and state police are now supporting ICE operations by providing crowd control or security, CBP is no longer necessary. Their mission they're now been taken over by local police and state police, and they can move on to another operation. Next question, please. From Darren Miller, what would you do in Minnesota given the current situation? Do you mean, if you mean in regards to if I was President Trump, I would have done exactly what he did. He put pressure on. My analysis of what the Trump administration did is that they used the ramp up from the initial Operation Metro Surge of an additional 2,200 federal agents to provide security for ICE operations, to demonstrate that the anti-ICE movement in Minneapolis was not going to deter the Trump administration from enforcing federal law, and to put pressure on the Minnesota officials to support ICE by deploying local police, because they, for roughly a month and a half, they had no support from Minneapolis PD, from the Minnesota State Police, the Minnesota National Guard, and there was a general level of unrest. And I think here, with the negotiation going on between Tom Homan and Walz and Jacob Fry, now that we're seeing reports on the ground that the police are providing crowd control outside of that hotel in Maple Grove, which is a suburb of Minneapolis, reports that there are other local police responding to crowd control, to do crowd control in Minneapolis. I think that was the objective of the Trump administration, is to say, this is the new normal. We are not going to back off on enforcing federal immigration law. And we want the assistance of local officials. And so I think that objective was complete. And I think it's likely we see Bovino go to another operation, because he has been moving between multiple operations. He was not all just in one. So he's the commander at large. So he was at Midway Blitz. He was at the head of basically most of these big named operations. Next question, please. From Bad Web. Okay, so Trump got what he wanted in Minnesota, but what about the unlawful behavior of the state's organized resistance? These people need to be arrested like the J6ers were. If they don't put it down now, it's going to get much worse. Well, I do think one of the strategies that the Trump resistance has been engaging in has been to push for Trump to overreach. I think the Trump administration is at a disadvantage on that, because the courts, especially the district courts, as far as I can tell, view basically any action taken by the Trump administration that should be within the Article 2 powers of the president as fundamentally illegitimate. That's just frankly the environment the Trump administration is dealing with. And I don't think that they have the political capital to spend. Like, I just don't think they have it to implement some of the same things that the Biden administration did, because they're fighting both a federal district court that I think fundamentally views things they do as illegitimate. Plus, they have still a federal bureaucracy that is filled with Biden holdovers and federal employees who also disagree with the Trump administration. And they have taken some steps for that. I think it was earlier this month. I forget which agency reported, but in fact, more than 300,000 federal employees have resigned since January 20th of last year. And the Trump administration has, I think, taken steps to try to effectively create filtering mechanisms to get rid of federal employees who would undermine the Trump administration's agenda. One of those things was going through the different federal agencies and telling them, you're doing immigration enforcement now. They did this with the FBI. They did this with a bunch of federal law enforcement agencies, the IRS, and different parts of the DOJ. They went to the Civil Rights Division. They went to the Community Relations Service and told them, well, you're lawyers. You're now working on immigration enforcement cases, which caused a lot of these resignations. They moved to eliminate degree requirements for ICE. I think it was in the middle of last year. They announced they're looking to do the same thing with the FBI. So I think the Trump administration has taken steps to try to stop or prevent some of the this inside outside strategy that activists have been implementing, but there's still obstacles they face. And one of those is the assumption that things that Trump does are illegitimate, things that Biden did are legitimate. And that's just unfortunately the reality of the battle space that Trump is dealing with. Next question, please. Ben brings up a great point about the international policy fatigue. We saw this at Davos, is still seeing it specifically in the polarization of our states, states creating their own international trade agreements. Can you talk a little about this and what we're likely to see moving forward? Well, just a reminder, states can't really create their own trade agreements. What they're doing is basically flying delegations to other countries, to sister states or sister cities, and saying, yeah, if you want to sell your stuff, we'll buy it, or we'll sell our stuff and you buy it. And then the Senate has to approve a trade treaty or the Trump administration has to make a trade deal. That's not the purview of the states. As far as the international policy fatigue, I understand that, but one of the things is that over the last 100 years, the president's authority over foreign policy has strengthened. He has a lot more room to move on foreign policy than he has domestic policy. Part of that's by design of the U.S. system. Things like police powers are delegated to the states constitutionally. There's limited things that the Trump administration can do when it comes to law enforcement, except for immigration law, and that's actually I think why that judge in Minneapolis or Minnesota has declined to place a restraining order on Operation Metro Surge, because there are areas where the Trump administration can move more freely and places where they can't. But I do understand the fatigue of people, especially people that voted for Trump, that want more domestic action. It's just the reality is that he has a lot more lateral movement he can take, a lot more room for things he can do internationally. All right, next question, please. From TrevCon Abel. Sarah Adams has talked about all the sleeper cells within the states. If the U.S. goes against Iran again, are you concerned those cells could go kinetic? Actually, we'll save this for Mike. I think having Mike on would add a lot more to the answer for that question.
Yep. For the other question, we're also saving that one for Mike. It's mapping software specifically regarding area studies, and he's literally writing the book on it. So,
okay.
No.
All right, next question then.
All caught up.
Oh, I see Bad Wabbit. I think she clarified. Okay, no, fatigue with other countries with our policies flip-flopping all the time. Well, if you're talking specifically about like the tariffs and trade deals, yeah, I'm sure other countries that are trade partners are they don't like changes in the status quo. One of the things the Trump administration outlined, Stephen Mirren, who's now on the Federal Reserve Board, but was previously the White House economic advisor. We brought up this before. He wrote this paper in November, somewhere between November and December 2024, outlining what they're doing. Basically, they're trying to get our trade partners to help pay for the reindustrialization of the United States, specifically the defense industrial base. But our foreign trade partners have their own motivations, right? Like the European trade partners that have export economies, that have strong export economies, they don't want to pay tariffs. They don't want their exports to become more expensive to bring into the United States. I'm sure that they are getting fatigued with the change in the status quo, but the way that's manifesting with like Mark Carney, I'm not sure that they are going to actually turn to China for maybe one part with Canada. I think that is a national security issue for the United States, and I think that the U.S. would put a lot of pressure on Carney not to follow through. With the Europeans, I think there's a motivation of economics. Like they're fatigued with the United States because we want them to pay tariffs on their exports coming into the United States, and their concern is that their exports are being undermined. But I don't think turning to China is the solution. I think they are aware that turning to China means that cheap imports are going to flood to their countries, because China wants to overproduce its way out of an potential economic crisis, and that means undermining their own industries. I think eventually they're going to come to the table. Some of them have already have or attempted to. I think also a big part of the international resistance from our allies to what Trump is trying to do with the U.S. internet, with this Gaza Board of Peace, with these changes to how the United States approaches the international rules-based order. I think it's because they benefited under the status quo, and they don't think they're going to benefit as much under a new status quo in a great era of great power competition. So I think this a lot of what they say about being fatigued and whatever, that this is all part of them trying to avoid those changes where they are going to benefit slightly less to the United States influence.
Yeah, just a quick note. I do think that the Europeans are going forward. They're going to have to deal with taking on their own security one way or another. They can either comply with the United States or they can just do it on their own, which they're going to struggle with. And the reason I say that is that due to declining birth rates, enhance basically technological development, it is harder for the United States to just maintain the global commons, which everybody has become accustomed to. It's going to have to retract. That's why we're saying a consolidation in the Western Hemisphere that will leave them open. It will leave them vulnerable to like piracy if they do not step up going forward. So I think this is much more of, even the United States, I think, is much more reactive to global developments than it is actually causing them, and that's going to drive the Europeans into just doing what Trump is saying they should be doing anyway.
And I saw a comment saying we pay the tariffs, not them. Yes, what I'm saying. So if you read Mirren's paper, a big part of it is effectively a wealth transfer, right? So they're not allowing Europe to. They're in real terms transferring wealth from European trade partners to the United States in capital. And the idea behind the tariffs is to allow more capital allocation or incentivize capital allocation to revamping the U.S. industrial base. And one of the things that the Trump administration is trying to do is thread the needle on not completely destroying the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency while incentivizing that reindustrialization. They're also trying to avoid the Triffin dilemma, basically where because we have to sell dollars means we have to buy things, and that means capital is no longer incentivized to go into new manufacturing capacity, and actually incentivizes undermining current manufacturing capacity. They're trying to thread the needle on all these things to continue ramping up the U.S. defense industrial base, which, if you read Mirren's paper, outlines, these are our trade partners who are exporting things to us because we have to sell dollars or we have to send dollars abroad. They've benefited from the deterrent effect of the U.S. security umbrella. And that system, as it existed until effectively this Trump administration, even the Biden administration had made some noises about this, has caused the industrial base of the United States to be gutted. And through that, also the defense industrial base, because officials thought over the last 40 years that we could export our manufacturing capacity to China and they would be America's factory forever. And we would transition to a service economy so we could continue sending dollars abroad to keep the dollar strong and keep it as the global, incentivize it as the global reserve currency. The Trump administration is trying to take, according to Mirren, incremental steps not to collapse that and not to entirely disincentivize imports, but to incentivize at least some investment in actual capital in the United States. So that really the tariffs, I think for the UK there was like a 10% tariff. So they're not trying to completely destroy imports. They're just trying to find a balance between sending dollars abroad and incentivizing investment in manufacturing here. All right, next question, please, Jared. From Thomas Jefferson, any more updates on Greenland? Sounds like Trump still wants to own it outright, but last I heard, the negotiations settled at sovereign U.S. military bases. Well, Jared, any updates on Greenland?
Just what was put out, I think it was a week and a half ago now, what the Trump administration achieved during Davos. And there was a lot of speculation of, it's one base. Well, it's not one base. The U.S. is going to get to decide how many bases it puts up there, or the extent to which it's going to expand those bases. It's effectively giving control of Greenland over to the United States due to the presence that the United States is looking to establish there. And the United States does want to use Greenland as essentially the front line for the Golden Dome, which is an air defense system, a missile defense system to protect the United States, specifically the Eastern Seaboard, from Russian over the Arctic intercontinental ballistic missiles.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Next question, please. Maryland General Assembly is currently considering a bill that would force the termination of all 287G agreements in the state by July. What alternatives do Maryland counties have? Well, not many. For the most part, this will vary by state, constitution specifically by state, but most states effectively have a lot of power over local governments that they can dissolve, and if they don't do what the state wants. I'm not sure in the case of Maryland if that is specifically in Maryland state constitution, what kind of powers the state has to enforce its will over local incorporated governments. But I think it's unlikely they have a whole lot of options as far as if they are forced to terminate those immigration agreements. They effectively, if there's a local or county government that disagrees with that, they could probably just quietly allow their cops to support ICE operations as far as like providing security for, any kind of anti-ICE activity. But I don't think they have a lot of options openly. Next question, please. Piracy in North Atlantic.
Yeah, I wanted to address this. Whenever for long-time subscribers, whenever they hear me talk about a new age of piracy, and specifically if the U.S. is pulling back from the international commons, seeing an uptick in piracy, that's not speaking necessarily about the North Atlantic, but the European powers depend on extra regional resources that would be subject to piracy. The Somali pirates are probably the most famous, but that's because that's the hotbed for piracy right now. Even the Chinese are out there combating piracy. It is a pervasive problem off of that part of Africa. And I think you'd see that in many places where you have choke points for international travel on the water.
All right. Well, next question, please, Jared.
Nope, that one's I answered that one in the chat, and I think we are caught up.
Well, I think I saw Bad Wabbit ask a question about what paper I was referencing. That is the User's Guide to Restructuring Global Trade that Stephen Mirren published through Hudson Bay Capital in November of 2024. I can actually drop a link in the global chat for the app after the show. But it is an interesting paper. It's very dense. But my takeaway was that basically the Trump administration, Scott Bessent, Stephen Mirren, especially, were trying to incentivize domestic capital to invest in the defense industrial base. One of the other ways they've been doing this is this flirting with state capitalism, effectively, as it's been called, by making public capital investments in things like critical mineral mining and refining and defense companies, putting pressure on defense contractors. But in the paper, Stephen Mirren outlines it pretty clearly. What they're trying to do is stave off the Triffin dilemma, not completely collapse the U.S. dollar reserve currency status, but at the same time that the sending money abroad and the incentivizing of offshoring industry has also made the United States defense industrial base weaker, and they're trying to reverse that. In his conception, the idea was by implementing these tariffs on our trade partners who have benefited from the U.S. global security umbrella, their conception is that the tariffs is moving real wealth from Europe back to the United States is basically forcing our trade partners to help pay some share of that global security umbrella. All right. Well, if that is the end of our questions, Jared, if you don't see any more, We have one more from Dragito. Any
Yeah, there
update
are
on the
a couple more
Alberta
coming.
secession movement and how that plays out with the current U.S.-Canada relations, especially considering the pivot by Canada towards China?
No update. I promise you, I am keeping much closer tabs on that because yes, the Albertans dislike what Carney has done, and they were already pushing for it. I think that'll. I think it'll give them a boost. And there was. Oh nope, that was it.
All right. Well, that's the last question for today. We will be back with you on the show tomorrow and in your inbox at 08 Central. Have a good rest of your day and stay out front.